I think it's normal to worry that standardizing how you do things might restrict your ability to innovate. And I also think on the other side that it's normal to struggle with chaos and then want to standardize absolutely everything. And in this video, I'm going to discuss the balance between explore and exploit and how balancing the optimization of the known with continually looking into the unknown is important for any system, including a business. Hi, my name is Zach Parsons, and on this channel I explore how to make teamwork less chaotic. So let's first talk about the concept of explore and exploit. At the extreme end of the spectrum, on the pure explore side, is where an individual or a system is only obtaining new knowledge and not using said knowledge to gain any benefit. On the other end, on the pure exploit side, that's where an individual or system is only using existing knowledge and not seeking to obtain new knowledge. Another way to think about it is that the exploration focuses on knowledge acquisition, whereas exploitation focuses on energy acquisition. And you can replace energy with revenue or profit or any other benefit that's going to be sought. So the downside of pure exploration is that you're not putting your newfound knowledge to good use. And the downside of pure exploitation is that you may either be A, missing out on greater returns than you're currently getting, or B, be unable to adapt to a changing environment. So to give an example, in Rory Sutherland's book, Alchemy, and also in his recent talk at Nudgestock, he talks about the bee's waggle dance, which is used to communicate to the rest of the hive about a known source of nectar or pollen, so essentially bee food, right? And most of the other bees will follow the instructions of the waggle dance and exploit the known sources of food, which is essentially a guaranteed short-term return on investment. However, what some members of the hive will do is completely ignore the waggle dance and just do their own thing. And they are essentially exploring to obtain new knowledge about different food sources. And this activity doesn't have a guaranteed short-term return on investment. That is to say, each individual trip might result in absolutely nothing. However, every now and again, they will hit the jackpot and find a new source of food. And as he highlights, both of these behaviors are required for the long-term success of the hive. So it's wildly inefficient for every bee to go off at random every time they leave the hive, especially when there are already known sources of food. However, the hive cannot rely on only known food sources, because at best they'll be making the most of or they won't be making the most of a local environment, as they could get there could be a great bunch of flowers like right next door and they're just completely ignoring it, and at worst all of their known sources of food could die out and or are otherwise removed in some way, and then the hive is just going to starve to death. So I hope the relevance to that example is to business is clear, but I'll connect the dots anyway. So in business, there are economies and efficiencies to be had by getting really damn good at doing one thing really well. However, not being aware of changes in customer preference can absolutely destroy your business. So for two examples, see Raising Cane's for chicken tenders for the former, and Kodak and digital photography for the latter. But that obviously raises questions, or raises a particularly important question, which is how much do you explore and how much do you exploit? And a paper from researchers at Ben Gurion University of the Negev suggests there are four phases to approaching the dilemma, and each phase is influenced by the system's time horizon and the unpredictability of the environment. And I'm going to briefly cover the four stages and then a couple of factors that influence those stages. This is only going to be like a really cursory summary, and I'd encourage you to read the full article if you so desire. So I said there were four phases. The first phase is knowledge establishment, And this is where the subject has no knowledge of the environment to exploit. So as such, they are only and can only be exploring. And with no exploitation happening, this exploration is at the cost of their existing reserves. What happens is that once a minimum knowledge of the existing resources and how to reach them have been established in that area, the subject can move on to the second phase. So if you imagine a beehive being moved to a new location, all the bees would have to be searching for new sources of food. And in business, this first stage is where the idea has yet to be validated. Moving on to the second stage, we're talking about knowledge accumulation. And in this phase, we already have a little bit of knowledge, but that existing knowledge is being exploited, but it's only being exploited to the point to keep the subject at a minimal predefined state. So all the other time that's available is then used to obtain new information that will have longer term rewards. So using our bee example, once they've found the first couple of sources of food, they can exploit those to ensure that the hive doesn't starve, but it would also make sense for them to continue putting significant energy into trying to find close, high quality sources of food. And I want to put a disclaimer here. I'm in no way an ecologist. The explore-exploit behavior is seen in bees. However, this might not be the precise behavior of bees in a new environment. So take everything I say about bees with a massive pinch of salt, especially from this point of the video onwards. In business, I would say that this is roughly around where the idea has been validated, but the model and market fit still needs to be refined. Once more exploring has been done, there is a phase that gets reached of knowledge maintenance. And in this phase, the goal is to update knowledge, but only to an optimum level. And otherwise, you just spend all of your resources on exploitation. So for bees, this would mean staying in the current hive, exploiting known sources of food while continuing to update their knowledge of food sources in the local environment. And for a business, this would mean using and updating knowledge relevant to existing products, but not pursuing new products. And I think that's really important, and we're going to come back to that. So keep that in mind. The fourth and final phase is knowledge exploitation. And this is the phase where no effort is put into obtaining new knowledge, and all efforts are put into using existing knowledge only. So while this will result in a short-term increase in energy acquisition, again, you can replace the word energy as appropriate, it is an unsustainable approach. So for bees at this point, again, this is purely conceptual, not an ecological truth, but if the bees were about to abandon a hive, you could imagine that they would spend time extracting as much food as they could from known sources to maximize their energy reserves before leaving the existing hive. In business, this might happen in the short term to exploit an immediate opportunity, but sustaining this phase will very likely lead to the business the business to fail in the long term because they lose focus on the wants and needs of their customer. I want to spend a little bit of time focusing on the maintenance phase of this model. The authors of the paper argue that the longer the period lasts, the more the subject has to gain. And Alex Hormozi often argues that a lot of the time, you're better off focusing on the thing you already have, that is to stay in the knowledge maintenance stage, than to constantly change your approach, as in go back to the knowledge exploration or the knowledge accumulation stages. Hormozi talks about this general principle in two ways. So at the macro level, he encourages against constantly changing your core focus of the business, at which you never reap the rewards of what he calls an informed optimist. And then at a micro level, he tries to hold off making changes to how things are done in the business, saying that he knows that he's probably going to feel a big loss in productivity. I think he says that this is like his own, like, it isn't backed up, that his general felt sense is that he loses about 20% of productivity as people are getting used to the new process. Whereas if he just leaves things alone, the productivity increases as people just naturally get better at their jobs. I spend a lot of time on this channel talking about balancing principles and procedures. Principles being non-prescriptive guidance for judgment, and procedures being step-by-step guidelines for achieving a clear and set result. I think the connection between exploiting behavior and procedures is quite clear. If you figured out something that works, get it documented so everyone is doing it in the optimum way so you can maximize your return. While exploitation appears to be a good thing for the long-term success of a system, whether it be an animal or business, it does still need to contribute to the goal of the business. So, for example, a bee going away and finding an old Big Mac and telling all of the other bees to head in that direction isn't going to do the hive any favors, right? So, in that way, any exploration needs to be done within the goals of the business, and principles at different levels of the business can support effective exploration at those various levels. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll challenge you to consider whether you're taking a considered approach to where you're exploring and where you're exploiting, and whether you're using principles and procedures to guide those activities. I am going to put some videos on screen now, which YouTube think you might like, of my own videos, of course, because I'm completely selfish and I'm not going to point you to other creators. I hope that video's been useful, and I look forward to seeing you in another one.